Hey everybody, it's Evan from Method at getmethod.com, and today we're talking about Maxwell's materials. This is the second video in our series where we're talking about Maxwell Render for Bonzai3d, and specifically we're talking about materials and how to apply them in Bonzai3d and how they just work right inside of Maxwell. So if you wanted to use the built-in materials that come with Bonzai, if you wanted to make your own materials from scratch, or if you wanted to use the ones that come with Maxwell or the ones that come from their website at the resource library, we're going to show you how to apply each one of those different types of materials to your models inside Bonzai before you render. All right, so let's jump right into it. So here we are in Bonzai, and I have a scene set up where all of the materials that you see that have been applied here have just been out of the Bonzai material library. And so what I mean by that is if you look in the materials palette over here, I've got all the basic materials that come in every Bonzai scene, but I've started to add my own. So for instance, here I have a wood deck material, and so that's coming out of the wood floor part of the library down here. I've got flooring, I've got shingles, and all of these are Bonzai materials. And the great thing about working in Maxwell is that it will automatically translate these materials without any extra work, so you can render exactly what you see here without having to learn anything about Maxwell. So basically, if you take a look up here, we're in the shaded work mode right now in the different display modes that we have. If we jump over to shaded full display, this gives us the option to see the project with shadows turned on. And so because I've added a Maxwell light, which I'll go more in depth in the next tutorial, but I also did cover in the general overview, part 1 of this series, is that you've got to have a Maxwell light in the scene in order to render. So this particular scene is using a physical sky, which is set up right here. And again, I already talked about how to cover that, and we'll go more in depth into that in the next tutorial. But that is what's giving us these shadows. So I can see exactly where those shadows are going to fall just by going to shaded full. And all of these materials that you see here just automatically translate over into Maxwell Render. So if I just click up here on the Maxwell Render button, it's going to build that project and send it into Maxwell. So here we are in Maxwell, and it's starting to render the file. And let me just zoom out here a little bit. With using the scroll wheel on the mouse, again, you can zoom in and zoom out inside this window as it starts to refine. And you can see in the preview window down here that those materials and everything are showing up pretty much how they were in Bonzai. Obviously, the shading is not as dark as it was in Bonzai because this is using, global illumination to go in and actually bounce light around in these dark pockets, and the shadows aren't going to be solid like they are in the OpenGL shaded mode inside of Bonzai. So immediately we have a really nice looking image with no effort at all. Everything that you already know from Bonzai just will automatically translate into Maxwell. So it's really fast to set up and very easy to use. And so you have materials like paints and glass, and we have water, and we've got concrete, and all of these are just automatically coming across very easily. Now, one thing that you do notice here in Maxwell as this image starts to refine is that some of these default textures need a little bit of work, and you can see up here in this trellis that it's got almost a mirror-like finish. It's really glossy. So we're going to need to look at editing that material in Bonzai, and I'll show you how to get rid of that. Also the siding on the actual side of the structure here, and most likely on the deck here as well, it's really reflective. So let's switch back to Bonzai here. And I'm going to go back to regular shaded mode. So what I'm going to do here in Bonzai now is I'm going to open up these materials and kind of show you a couple little hints that are going to make things a little bit easier. So here's my wood deck material, and this is the wood siding that I used on the side of this structure. And one thing that is really helpful is not to look at our preview here in a cube, because it doesn't give us an idea of the highlights. And remember in Maxwell it looked really glossy. If I switch back over there, you can see that that's pretty glossy up inside there. If I zoom in on that, we're getting a pretty high level of reflection. I'm going to jump back to Bonzai here, and if I go to the reflection tab, you'll notice here that specular is set up to 37. And one thing you'll notice is that if I switch this, move this up and down, the preview doesn't really change. So what you want to do is you want to set this to the sphere preview type. And that gives you an idea of the amount of highlight that you're getting. And so if I turn this down, you can see that highlight starts to go away, whereas before on the cube we couldn't really notice that. So what I'm going to do is turn that way down. I do want a little bit of gloss on there to show that it has some type of a finish. And then I'm also going to turn up the roughness. And real quick, just to illustrate what this does, I'll turn this back up higher. And watch what happens when I turn the roughness up. See how the specular gets larger? And what that's doing is it's making the overall roughness of the material bigger so that specular highlight is more broad. So I like that broad, but I also want very little specular. Okay, so make sure you turn these material previews into the sphere, which will really help with your specular factor. And so I'm also going to do that for this accent paint. If we go back into there, again, in the reflection tab for that, if I jump to a sphere preview, you can now see why, and go back to Maxwell here, my paint is very reflective. Okay, so if I turn that spec factor way down, could go to 0, turn the roughness up, you just play with these numbers and get a number that looks right. And now you can start to see that that's going to look more like a matte paint job. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is send that back to Maxwell again by clicking on this button, and let's take a look and see how it starts to render now. Okay, so here we are in Maxwell again, and you can see now that the accent paint color and the wood siding on the side of the building are now not reflecting like they were before. So they no longer have that heavy varnish or that mirror-like reflection. So instead of actually going through the entire process there of jumping out into Maxwell just to test that kind of thing, you can do that right here inside of Bonzai instead. So let me show you. Let's open up the flooring again. And let's turn up the specular factor back kind of where it was before for a second. Okay, so we can see the Bonzai representation here. What we can do is actually switch to a Maxwell representation. Okay, and we can click on this little refresh button right here, and it will actually render us a sample of what that looks like without having to go into Maxwell Render and render the entire scene. So that refines just like it does in Maxwell right here inside of Bonzai. So you can see that heavy specular highlight. And you can see here that when we switch to the Maxwell material type, and you might also have a render zone material type if you have render zone installed. When we switch to Maxwell, you can see that we're translating the shaded material. So if we switch back to shaded mode, and we turn the specular factor down, and let's turn the roughness up, I'm going to again switch back to Maxwell here, and it's still using the old one. I'm going to refresh that, and that will again re-render the preview right here, and it will show us a new example of what our new settings just changed. So that's kind of an easy way for you to set up these materials ahead of time and not have to render the scene, come back to Bonzai, update the material, and then keep going back and forth to do that when you can handle it all right inside of here. Okay, so now that I've got that one set up, I'm going to go ahead and just close that up, and you can see that our little thumbnail here gets updated with the latest version. Alright, so let's look at these material hints a little bit closer. What I'm going to do here is illustrate this with a metallic texture. Okay, so I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to do a basic color here. Let's go ahead and choose like a bluish gray color. Like that. And again, I'm going to switch this over to the spherical preview, and that just gives us, it looks like kind of a basic plastic in this preview, because that's what Bonzai is capable of showing us in OpenGL. I'm going to switch over to Maxwell, and again with the material hint, right now it's just using closest match. So if I refresh the preview here and replace the thumbnail, you can see that based on the shaded settings, which we had, which we also need to go back and look at here real quick, our reflection settings. It's taking all of these into account, reflection, transparency, and color. It's taking all those into account when it draws the preview for the Maxwell material type. So this again looks like a highly polished plastic. So if we actually wanted to make this, let's go ahead and name this aluminum. And let's go ahead and change the material hint to aluminum. It's going to change the properties based on a metallic type of material. So now you can see when it refreshes that, it looks like a chrome ball. And that really has to do with those specular settings again. So let's jump back to our shaded type, go to our reflection tab. And so again, we want to look at the specular factor and the specular roughness. I'm going to turn that specular roughness up this time. Let's go ahead and keep the highlight, but let's turn that roughness up to say 70%. Jump back to the Maxwell type and refresh the preview and watch the difference between the before and after now when it refreshes the thumbnail. So you can see now what that specular roughness is doing is that it's diffusing that highlight out and making this look more like an anodized aluminum. So you do want to use material hints, which are kind of its best guesses here for the types of materials you're using, and you can see there's a limited list here, but these will get you in the ballpark if you're not quite ready to go all out for a Maxwell material. All right, so that's how you can use material hints to make your textures and materials look even better. So what I'm going to do now is I want to show you how to basically apply materials. So let's just look down here at this gravel that I have applied. If I wanted to apply a different material, like let's say I want to apply this mulch down here, there's two ways you can do it inside of Bonzai. The first way is just drag and drop the material onto the object, and you can see it maps that material right onto there. And you take note real quick of the size of that material. You can kind of see that it's pretty large. Okay, I'm going to undo that. Now I'm going to go over here, and under the Manage section, I'm going to click on the Paint Bucket tool, and I'm going to click now on this. And one thing that you want to take a look at is the default texture size when you're applying these textures. If you double click on there, you can change the default texture size. So if I switch this to 2 feet, for instance, I'm going to close that up. You can see that it did not change the size of the texture, but if I click on it again with the paint bucket, it will reapply the texture at the default size. So it gets it smaller when you do that. Okay. The other way to change the actual size of the texture, which is probably a better way to do it, is click on the object once you've applied the texture. And if I zoom out here, you can see we get these texture editing handles where I can change the rotation of the texture on the object, or I can change the scale of it and get it exactly how I want it. Or if you don't want to do it graphically, you can control all those over here in your tool options by setting the size. So if I wanted 3 feet, for instance, I'm not changing the default texture size by doing that. I'm changing it only on that object when I do it in the tool options in conjunction with the Edit Texture tool. All right, so you can modify it graphically, or you can modify it over here with a number by typing that in. And again, it's not modifying the default texture size. So again, if I just click on it with the paint bucket, it goes back to the default texture size that I had entered. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the limitations with using the materials that come straight out of Bonzai. Again, if we just go back into these, let's go back and apply our gravel back to this object down here. And I'll double click on gravel. You'll notice that the limitations of the Bonzai material parameters are that we only have these 3 channels to work with. We have color, reflection, and transparency. Well, you'll notice that some big ones are missing here, which are mainly bump and displacement. And that's one great thing about the Maxwell rendering application, is that it allows us to do not only bumps, but also take that to the next level with displacement. So what I want to do here is I want to kind of show you the difference. I'm going to zoom in on this, and I'm just going to save this view real quick. And I'm going to send this view to Maxwell Render. so that we can do a before and after comparison. Okay, so look at this now. Right inside of Bonzai, you can see that we have no bump, no displacement, but that's how it always is inside our OpenGL renderer. Okay, so here we are, and Maxwell now is launching, and as this again gets refined, we're going to see that it's taking that bitmap image and it's applied it to that polygon, but there's no bump and no displacement. So as this refines and gets better and better looking, it doesn't look really convincing. So what I want to do now, I'm just going to go ahead and stop that. I'm going to jump back into Bonzai. Okay, so if you want, in the most critical situations, to have it where the material actually has more definition, namely bump or displacement, you're going to want to use a Maxwell material, otherwise known as an MXM. Okay, so let's talk about where we can get more of these Maxwell materials. If you go to this website, which is resources.maxwellrender.com, it'll bring you to this page here, and you're going to want to register for an account by filling out this information. I'm going to go ahead and log in real quick. So there's materials, there's skies, and there's HDRI files in here. And if you want to search your MXM materials, you can search for materials. Let's look up something that we could use in our project, like some kind of a stone or a rock. And what I'm going to do is scroll down here and click on this one, and you can see that these previews give a really good idea of what this is going to look like in your project. And so once you're logged in, you can actually click on these links to download them. So I'm going to download that real quick. And while that's downloading, let's go through here and look at some of the other things. So for instance, let's look at glass. And you can see some of the different great glass examples that they've given. A lot of great architectural materials in here, as well as other things. Some of the materials even include a preview. Like this one down here, you can see this extra preview that they've given. So you can actually see what it looks like when it's been applied. So this is an example of something you might apply to the side of a building. And so they give you a preview to give you an idea of that. So if you go back to the main materials page, there are ways to sort through those. And you can also see the ones that have been uploaded very recently. But there's some concrete ones in here that are great. There's also, roofing materials, depending on what you're looking for. You can see there's a lot of good ones. There's a metal one. There's some shingles. There's some tiles. So get familiar with this website. There's a lot of great resources, hundreds of them, and they're all available free to you. So once you've downloaded an MXM Maxwell material file, you're going to want to go ahead and put that zip file wherever it is that you're saving your textures on your computer. So I have a separate folder here, aside from my Maxwell materials folder in the applications folder, that I keep my materials as I go through them and create them. And so again, this is on a separate hard drive. I'm going to move that zip file into that folder and unpack that zip file. Once you've unpacked it, you can go ahead and toss that. And then you can double click and open up that folder, and you want to find the file in here with the MXM extension, and that's the Maxwell material file itself. Go ahead and double click that file, and that's going to open up the MXED application, which is the Maxwell material editor. Once you've opened up the file in there, you want to go File, Save MXM. And you want to go through this each time you download a material from the resources website, because what that does is when you open it up in MXED and just save it, that goes through all of the file paths, which everywhere there's a orange and black checkerboard, that indicates that we have a bitmap associated, and that goes and fixes all of those file paths automatically. So once you've done that, all you need to do is quit that. You can go ahead and say yes here. And now your Maxwell material is ready for use. If you want to learn more about MXED, you can obviously look in the manual to learn more about how these layer systems work inside MXED. You can also go to the website, which will, if you go to think.maxwellrender.com, you can go to, there's a couple of different areas here. You can search for tutorials, but you can also go to First Steps, and you can learn more about Maxwell materials here. And here is one that introduces you to the stacked layer system, which is another video tutorial. And there's lots of other things to work from right on this website. So again, that's think.maxwellrender.com. Okay, so now let's look at referencing an MXM file or a Maxwell material file to replace this wood decking right here. All right, so what we're going to do is create a new material, double click, and change the material type to Maxwell. And instead of doing a translate shaded, we're going to now choose referenced MXM file. And we're going to load up from our applications Maxwell materials database. If you look in your MXM files directory here, there's a bunch of MXM files or Maxwell material files that come with Maxwell. What I'm going to do here is load my outdoor decking MXM file. And so I'm going to replace this Bonzai one here with this one. And when you load up an MXM file, you'll notice that this is still called Material 39. If you click the little quotes button right here, that replaces the name with the MXM file name. And what I'm going to do now is use my paint bucket tool and just apply that material to these objects. And they came in a little bit small. What I'm going to do here is actually update the material texture size to 8 feet. I'm just going to reapply that real quick now so that that's the right size. And what I'm going to do now is do a rendering here with this Maxwell material, and I'm going to get up real close here so you can actually see it. We're going to see that extra level of realism. So I'm going to click on Maxwell, let it build the Maxwell scene files. And now that we're in Maxwell here, we're going to load up this file and let it start rendering so we can actually see the difference here between the Bonzai material and this new Maxwell material. So you can see here in the preview again the level of realism. Now we have bump, we have better specular highlights because we actually have we could have a specular map controlling where the highlights happen in a material like this. So for instance, between the boards, obviously we didn't model every one of these boards, and you're going to notice that we'll never get a highlight in the creases between the boards, for instance, because we're using a specular map to control that in the MXED material. So let's go to this view and let's talk about this gravel down here. So again, this gravel is just a flat bitmap applied to a flat polygon. And one thing that would really help with an extra level of realism here is to use a displacement map or a material, an MXM file that includes displacement. So I'm going to load up one. Again, I'm going to choose the Maxwell material type. I'm going to do a referenced MXM, and I'm going to open up. And this also gives me the opportunity to show you that you don't have to keep your MXM files inside the Maxwell folder in your applications. I also have some stored on a separate hard drive here. I have a whole Maxwell materials directory. So as I kind of sort and go through my Maxwell files, I'm creating this directory here of ones that I use quite a bit. And so what I'm going to do is open up this rock material that I have, and again I'm going to hit the quotations button just to name that material correctly, and I'm going to close that and just apply it to this polygon. Now sometimes I can't really explain why this happens, because sometimes this doesn't happen, is that when you apply the material to the object, the bitmap doesn't show up. And I'm hoping that this is something that can be overcome in a future release, but for right now, there's sometimes you're going to have to do an actual render to see what this is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to again click the Maxwell button and let this launch Maxwell Render. And let's take a look and see what happens when we apply a material with displacement to an object. Okay, so here we are in Maxwell Render again, and I'm going to kind of zoom over and pan in on this and let this refine. One thing that happens when you apply a map with displacement to a polygon or an object inside Bonzai is that it actually does push the polygons up and down to start to create that displacement map. And so instead of just a bump map where it's kind of tricking the eye into thinking that there's a little bit of texture there, this actually does displace polygons and actually kind of build the model for you in that area to make it look like that material really is a bunch of separate rocks, even though this is just a big single polygon. And you'll notice that if you just apply that to a large polygon inside Maxwell or inside Bonzai, you can see that it kind of works and it starts to push those polygons up and down, and we're seeing that displacement back here. But you'll also notice that it's kind of doing it in streaks, and so that doesn't look quite right. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just stop that. And let's go ahead and quit out of Maxwell and jump back into Bonzai. And this is just another little trick that you're going to want to use, is you're going to want to mesh the object. And you're going to want to set the mesh size to something like, I don't know, let's do it at 6 inches on this one. It depends on how dense that displacement needs to be, but I found 6 inches to work pretty well. So all I do is simply click on that object, and you can see now it's subdivided that polygon into 6-inch divisions. And I'm just going to quickly just paint that one more time with that texture, and I'm going to hit the Maxwell button one more time now. And so now here we are back in Maxwell, and this is starting to render again. You can see now in the preview, and you can start to see it here, that each individual rock is now pushing up, and this is now subdivided correctly where the displacement is really working well. Now, because Bonzai doesn't have its own bump or displacement channels, you have to go back into MXED to control the amount of displacement. So, for instance, if these rocks were pumping up a little bit too high, you can go back into Bonzai and open up that material, and you can click on this fourth button right here, which is a shortcut to open this material inside MXED. So clicking that launches MXED with that material loaded. You can go into the displacement channel and you could lower that down. Make sure you save it again. Okay, and then when you come back, you don't have to update this preview. You could. I'm going to go ahead and launch this again. And when we get back in here in Maxwell, it's going to reload the Maxwell scene file and start rendering it again. And you'll see now that that displacement is less than it just was. So in order to change some of these settings, like the amount of bump, the amount of displacement, you do have to do that in MXED because those controls just aren't available in Bonzai. Okay, so one thing that I do want to give you a hint about is with the arrowway textures. If I jump to my materials database here and I look in my MXM files, there is a folder called Arrowway V2 that is included when you download Maxwell. And one of the problems here is that not all of the files are actually included with that. And so if you look, we have boards 1, and we have the 3 files that support boards 1. If I open that up, you can see that's what boards 1 is supposed to look like when it renders. And that material is built up off of these 3 different bitmaps. Boards 2 is built up off of these 3 bitmaps. And then you'll notice that like boards 3, this is what it's supposed to look like when it renders, but none of the supporting files are actually included. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to the portal site, which is here, portal.nextlimit.com, which is the same place where you download Maxwell once you get your license. So I'm going to go to the download area, and about halfway down the page here, we have this other download section, which I talked about in the video number 1 in the series, is you can download the Arrowway materials collection for Maxwell Render. And you can see it's a 53 megabyte file. It's a zip that includes all of the Arrowway textures and all the dependencies. And so once you download that, it's going to give you a new folder. Okay, so once you download that, you get all of these textures. So boards 3, does now have the 3 dependencies that it needs to build that texture. All right, so that's another workaround, a little hint for the Arrowway materials, which are great materials. It just, for some reason, in the actual Maxwell download, not everything has been included. Once again, you're going to want to go through MXED and make sure all the links to each one of these is set up correctly and resave those, because a lot of times the bitmaps, somebody else built these on their computer and the file paths are going to be linked up to where they were on their computer. All right, so I'm going to add a few more materials to my Bonzai scene here. Let's go ahead and add a water material. So again, I'm going to use a Maxwell water because the Bonzai water just gave us a reflection, but it didn't give us any waves or anything. And the one from Maxwell is really nice. So I have this one that I've already downloaded, and I'm going to apply that. Again, click the quotations button and apply that material to my water. And I'm going to add one more material, and let's do a concrete. So I'm going to do a Maxwell material, and let's do a board form, concrete material, and let's go ahead and quote that and apply it to a couple areas on our project. All right, and let's render this out. Okay, so here's our final scene, and you can tell with a little bit of know-how here in Maxwell, we've made a really great looking image. And this is the straight out render. This hasn't been retouched in Photoshop at all. And some materials were worth going through the extra effort and applying the Maxwell materials or the MXM files. And then some of them, we can get away with just using the ones that we used straight out of Bonzai's library that comes with Bonzai. So all the wood on that back part of the house there, that's all standard stock right out of Bonzai. The glass is right out of Bonzai. The siding on the house, the roofing material, all of the green paint. And then just in special instances where I wanted to use, the Maxwell materials with the water and with anywhere that I need displacement in the rocks or in the grass, I would go ahead and use a Maxwell material for that. But otherwise, we're sticking straight to the stock textures in Bonzai. So it's really easy and straightforward to get up and running in this package. All right, so that wraps up part 2 in our series on Maxwell Render for Bonzai3d. And just as a recap, we talked about materials and using the built-in ones that come with Bonzai and how those automatically translate into Maxwell materials. Or if you wanted to use the Maxwell materials that come in the Maxwell folder on your hard drive, or download more from resources.maxwellrender.com. Any way that you want to do it, depending on the realism of the texture that you're looking for, you want to pick the appropriate usage there. And also make sure that you're looking out for making sure the file paths are mapped correctly inside those MXM files. In our next video tutorial in part 3, we're going to talk about exterior rendering, so setting up the lighting for that. We haven't talked much about Maxwell's lighting, and so we're going to look at sky domes, physical skies, and HDRIs for image-based lighting. And we're going to talk about those 3 different things. I'm excited to show those to you. So watch out for part 3. And of course, check out the other videos at getmethod.com and let me know what you think. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.